Time for a special focus on Shelton here, presented by Peninsula Credit Union. I'm with City Manager Jeff Niten and Chief of Police Carole Beason. How you guys doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Good to talk with you. We are talking today about a proposed ordinance on private property. I was going through your study session you had on the 22nd of the month here, and we're looking at different ways to hold private property landowners accountable if there are homeless encampments that pop up, not to necessarily be confused with folks that come and visit and stay camping like that, but we've seen in the community these little encampments pop up around, and you're looking at ways to try to clean that up. Is that the purpose behind this, Chief? Let's start with you.
Yeah, what we are looking at is a lot of properties where they have either more people living on that property than the utilities will allow, or properties that haven't been developed where there's enough seclusion that people are making their homes in these properties. Shortly after I got here, I went out with Code Enforcement Officer Shannon Watanabe to see what the scope of the issue she's dealing with is. And she took me to several properties, and all of the enforcement that she does, or at least the vast majority, is complaint-driven by people in the community that see stuff that they're concerned about or fear or a safety hazard. One of the properties that she took me to over on Lake Boulevard, it's a residential neighborhood, and there was a property that had a bunch of like travel trailers and then those portable storage units. There were at least half a dozen of them on that property, and there were people living in every one of them. And all of the neighbors were calling in wanting that property cleaned up. And rightfully so. You know, it must be really embarrassing to have this going on your street. And of course, there are no facilities in any of those storage containers, so they were basically using big utility buckets, and when they were done, they would just throw in the green space behind. So it's also a health hazard as well. Another property they took me to over on Beverly Boulevard had a gutted-out motorhome in the front yard. It had no windows, it had no door, and the entire floor of it was covered in hypodermic syringes. Someone had taken some plywood and put a makeshift shelter on the back of this house, and they had a pile of garbage in the back that almost reached the roof of the house. And all I kept thinking is, if I had children in this neighborhood, I wouldn't want them to go out and play, because if they ended up in that motorhome, they could definitely get hurt doing that. Of course, this summer, we had a homicide where a homeless person murdered another homeless person in a homeless encampment on private property over on Turner Avenue. And most recently, on a property right off 101 just south of Wallace Neyland, we had a fire during the winter where people were trying to keep themselves warm, and luckily the fire department was able to get that fire put out before any structures or anything were in danger. But these are the types of properties that we want to be able to take enforcement action if necessary, if we can't get voluntary compliance, because while we understand that property owners have rights, their neighbors do too. And as I said, the vast majority of what we do is complaint driven. And I got to tell you, if I lived in any of these areas, I would be really concerned if this was my neighborhood and the people in the city couldn't do anything to help me live in a place where I want to live.
I've talked in the past with former police chief and other folks from the city about the length of time it takes to get a process like this done. Is that because of, like you said, the property rights of the owner of that property there, and how you document all of the issues? Would this ordinance speed that up, or how would this work to make this, actually have things happen with this?
Yeah, so the big part of the ordinance, in my mind anyway, is adding these types of encampments to what we call the nuisance list. And currently our ordinance doesn't include, the nuisance ordinance doesn't include these types of activities. So this ordinance is intended to move that to the nuisance list, where we do have an enforcement mechanism already in the code that we can use to apply and take care of those issues.
What are some of the other things on that list already?
Nuisance issues are things like, the one everybody thinks of is, and we won't have too many of those here, but like a private pool that you need to secure in order to, so it's not an attractive nuisance. Someone can't get in there and hurt themselves. But we have a whole list of 16 things, and that ordinance will be available and will be talked about again at a study session on, I believe, May 27th. I'm not exactly sure of that date, but the last study session in May for our council.
Okay. And some of the other things that you talked about in your last study session were large tracts of land that people have, 5 acres or better, that it's hard to know what's all happening on there, even if maybe you lived on the property because it's so large. How would this impact that, or what would it do to address all that?
At the study session, there were some folks that were asking if property owners were trying to keep camps off of their property. What could they do? If they clean it up and then people come back, they end up with a revolving door. And I get that. We have seen that with some properties that have been cleared out where you give it a little bit of time and they come back. And I had mentioned at the time a concept that is called crime prevention through environmental design. And unfortunately, some people took that to mean I was saying that everybody had to cut down all of their trees on their property. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Crime prevention through environmental design is a concept where people that have been trained go and look at properties and make suggestions to property owners as to things that they can do to make their property more defensible and less appealing for anyone that might be up to no good. Things like hostile vegetation. They talk about at a house you put rose bushes under your windows so people wouldn't be able to get into your house through your windows. In Southern California, we use bougainvilleas a lot because they've got really great thorns on them. And I got to tell you, in my experience in the Pacific Northwest so far, I think the most hostile vegetation that I've come across are those wild blackberries. But things like that are going to make properties less attractive for folks that are up to no good. So thinning out trees so you can see properties from the street, or clearing out brush so that you can see better, adding some kind of lighting, all of the things that make it so people aren't up to things in the cover of darkness.
Yeah, and that's some of the things we as a city have done, is on the Library Hill Trail. We have limbed up some of the trees going up that trail so when an officer drives by, they can look and see what's happening. And that's exactly what we're talking about.
What about for the property owners, the rights of those property owners who say, well, I feel that there is a huge issue with homelessness, and I'm going to do what I think is right to let these folks have at least a place to come back at the end of the night?
Mm-hmm. So I think with that, as long as we have provisions, our focus is on providing or protecting health and safety. And as long as there are provisions for, sanitation, as Chief Beason mentioned earlier, those types of things, we need to protect the entire community. And we'll do what we need, do what we should do in order to protect that. One of the things, the council's strategic goals is community life and the enhancement or pride in local neighborhoods. And those are some of the things we're trying to do through several of the ordinances we've adopted with the camping on public property, those ordinances, the one that council is considering now, those ordinances. But we want to make sure that we listen to the entire community when we're crafting these things, because we will have to implement them, and we want to implement them in a way that's as efficient and helpful to everybody as possible.
If you're putting some limitations on camping on public property and putting limitations on camping on private property, where is there left to go?
So there are shelter beds available, and we've heard, and this is anecdotal, but we've heard many instances where people that are in that situation do not want to take advantage of the beds that are available. And it's important to the community overall that we provide those services to folks that are experiencing homelessness. But if they're not going to take advantage of them when they're available, we have to have other options.
What are the next steps for this proposed ordinance?
So the study session I mentioned with the council, the last study session in May, it will come back again to a business agenda in the future. We don't have an exact date on that. It depends on what suggestions the council has for that ordinance if we need to amend it. But it's likely it will go back to the business agenda and then on to action sometime this summer.
How common is this with other police departments? I mean, how much enforcement do you know of in other police departments around the area that do something similar like this?
So I think most municipalities have some semblance of code enforcement for these types of issues. Where I came from, San Diego is the 7th largest city in the United States. So they have a whole army of code enforcement folks that go out to deal with these types of quality of life issues to make the community safer for everybody. I mean, at the end of the day, all of us want to feel safe in the community and be proud of where we live and work. And that's really the purpose of this, is that, if we don't have the tools here to try to help people in this community, no one else is going to be able to do that for them either. So that's our hope, is that, through education and, the vast majority of property owners, when we get in contact with them, they're more than willing to work with Shannon and Lexi and figure out a plan. We encourage people, if you have property, to fill out a trespass letter giving us authorization if people call, or even the property owner calls and says, hey, I know there's people there. Can you go and ask them to get off of my property? And posting signs saying that they're not allowing people there, that's also a good place to start. We're going to get the form that we have and put it on our website so folks would be able to fill it out and then send it back to us so that we would have a list. But again, it's going to be complaint driven. If people are calling in and saying, we're not just going to go to people's properties simply because they put in a trespass letter, we would have to get calls to go out there that people are out there, or that the property owner's been there and says, hey, I don't want these people here. But ultimately, we all kind of have the same goal here. It's just, making sure that we have the tools. And like we talked about in the study session, the abatement part of this is as a last resort. We want to be able to work with property owners. We want to be able to make suggestions and make it a partnership to solve some of these issues. But in the event we have property owners that either we can't locate them to contact them, or they just aren't interested in doing anything with that property, then we need to have more tools available to us to make the rest of the community safe. I can't imagine being on a property, having my own property, and realizing that my kids can't go out and play because of stuff that's going on, or I don't want to invite people over because they have to go by that unsightly property that's on my street on their way to come and visit me in my house. And I think that most people in Shelton don't want to live that way either.
How common is it that you can't find the property owner who's on the title? Is it, and I guess going back to some of those examples that you said that you drove by and noticed, do you have information on whether or not that it is the property owners, for the most part, living on the property that also has these, or are they renters of a property and they've allowed other folks to come on? Locating
the property owner part I can tackle. So some of those property owners live out of state. We had, as an example, the cleanup that the city did in partnership with Simpson on the side of SR3 across from the yacht club. There are some property owners there that live in Florida, and we don't have telephone numbers to contact them. Your property records at the county don't contain your telephone number. It's all by letter. So that takes a while, and easy enough. It didn't happen in the case of the property owner in Florida, but it's easy enough to ignore a letter.
Sure.
And we can search and we can find those things, but it's not a simple. Your property records don't have your email address.
Right.
Yeah. Depending on how dangerous the situation is or how extreme it is, we may have to take action before snail mail gets to wherever they are. If it's like the property on 101 with a fire, we have to clear that out so that it doesn't happen again. So it's all a balancing act. Most of the time, if we can get in touch with the property owner, they're more than willing to work with us. And Shannon and Alexi are great. They're going to come up with as many solutions as possible. And we've got other partners in the community that help us out too. Last year, Ted Jackson at United Way did a day of caring, and my code enforcement folks and I went out with them to help people clean up their property, and the United Way led the charge for that. So there are plenty of options for people, and there's plenty of people around that want to help out. It's just, in the event, as a last case and resort, we need to have something that we can do to hold these property owners accountable in the event that we can't get any compliance from them, we can't find them, and the situation is dangerous enough that it's going to negatively impact the rest of the community.
An important focus on Shelton here, presented by Peninsula Credit Union, talking about that proposed ordinance on private property here with City Manager Jeff Niten and Police Chief Carole Beason. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.